Live Mick Jagger has been talking for Rock On to Anne Nightingale. Mick's ably assisted by Ron Wood as he talks about the album and other assorted things. Not to be left out, the Doobie Brothers. After recent performances in Britain, they're now celebrating the immediate success of their latest vinyl offering, Livin on the Fault Line, which appears in the American charts as the biggest new entry. Melissa Rhodes makes her entry from LA via the transatlantic line, and Bob Kilby's assembling our studio roundup. Bob's around now, though, as we begin with the Doobies. Title track from the Doobie Brothers' new album, Livin on the Fault Line. Pat Simmons is the Doobies' spokesman this time round, and he talks to Bob Kilby.
Well, Pat, it's nice to see you back in Britain again, and I think I'd like to take you back to the early days of the Doobies to start off with, because things weren't always as successful as they are now, were they? It was a hard life in those early years.
True. Yeah, we started out as more or less of a bar band, a pub band, I guess you'd call it over here. Worked a lot of dates for the Hells Angels and for pretty much all we could drink. That was our pay most of the time.
Well, you got a record deal with Warner Brothers, and you made the first album, which was called simply The Doobie Brothers. And it wasn't as successful as perhaps you would have hoped.
No, it wasn't successful at all, really, although it did enable us to get a lot of jobs around the San Francisco area. It was nice to have an album to be able to go into bars with and say, well, we're a recording band, we made an album, and that was sort of impressive at that point. So that did help us that much anyway.
Well, your second album was a totally different story altogether, because that was the first of your 6 gold albums. Toulouse Street was the title, and Listen to the Music was the track off that album, which is particularly favoured over here. There was a slight change on that album, I thought, Pat. It was perhaps a harder edge than the first album.
It was at that point that we began the 2 drummers, which we had always had one drummer for about 2 years, and then at that point we added another drummer, so that was sort of a new type of a band for us.
That's one of the features of the Doobies, though. With 2 drummers, it gives you that extra drive on stage.
Yeah, for sure, especially when we were playing clubs in those days. We had no way to amplify the drums at all, so having 2 drummers was that extra added punch that we needed. That continued, and it has continued right up till the present. We have 2 drummers now as well, so actually 3 drummers now.
You had a very distinctive sound early on in your career, because Listen to the Music, as I mentioned, the choppy guitar licks and Tom's vocals, it really did identify you immediately with the rock fraternity, I think.
Yeah, we've always been into the rhythm guitars. That's been our forte. Still, in a sense, the rhythm guitars play an important role in the band. That's kind of a little bit of our trademark. So.
The album after Toulouse Street was The Captain and Me, which was hugely successful in America, and once again a huge hit from it, Long Train Running. Almost sounded like a soul hit to me the first time I heard it.
That was our Latin. We were trying to fuse a little bit of Latin into the band at that point. Actually, we've always done a little bit sort of a Latin type of sound, and what with 2 drummers, we got into applying different kinds of percussion at that point too. That album, the congas play a sort of an important role in that particular cut, so that was a little bit of our Latin fusion coming out there.
Presumably with the success of that album, you started playing the bigger halls in the States.
Well, we continued to tour after we released Listen to the Music. That was our really first successful major tour. We toured America for, God, I don't know, that whole year after that album and the whole year after The Captain and Me. We pretty much toured continuously. So about the end of, I think the end of 73 into 74, we were finally beginning to play some of the bigger halls. That was sort of our debut as a headline band at that point.
Tom Johnson was writing most of the lyrics at that time.
Well, we kind of split it between the 2 of us. Tom wrote about half the tunes, and I wrote about half the tunes at that point. He still is continuing to write tunes, not as many recently, but he's still doing it.
Your songs, Pat, tend to be rather more mellow than some of the Doobies' songs. For instance, Black Water was a huge hit for you, again a number 1 in the States, and that was your song. Do you favour a more mellow approach to songwriting?
Yes and no. I've usually looked at our albums as we were working on them and tried to fill in some of the gaps at times. I think we've all done that. When we do an album, we try to do a cross-section of tunes that hopefully will be appealing to a wider audience. And in those days, Tom was writing the rock and roll, and I saw that we really needed some more laid-back type things, and I was writing the laid-back things. I write rock and roll tunes too, but country blues is more probably my basic roots also, which is where that comes from. So
Blackwater had a very nice a cappella section there.
yeah, that's something I'd always wanted to try, doing some a cappella things. I was really into voice at one point in my schooling. I at one point wanted to be a vocal teacher, and I've always been heavily influenced by harmony and choral singing and stuff, so that was kind of the chance to do it on that record.
It's one of the strong points of the Doobies, I think, Pat, because everybody sings in the band, so your harmony is very strong.
Yeah, it's, for me, well, for everybody in the band, really, it's always been one of our major goals, is to be a good vocal group as well as an instrumental band. We wanted to put the two together. I suppose we've been influenced by a lot of our peers in that respect, the Eagles and Steely Dan and some of those people.
Interesting you should mention Steely Dan, because there must be a very strong influence from that band. You've got Jeff Baxter, who was famous with Steely Dan in the early days, and of course Mike McDonald. The first album, I think, where Jeff Baxter really came to the fore was probably Stampede, and I gather you and he worked very hard on that album together.
Yeah, we started the album, and it was going very well for a time, and then Tom Johnston, who had been very active in the band, sort of started to fade out at that point, so Jeff and I sort of had to pick up the ball and run with it, and we barely got that album together and got it out. We had to do a tour as well coming up, so we worked real hard on it to get it together, and Tom did the best he could. He did real well as far as that goes. He sang real well and played real well, but still at that point he was sort of burning out. He didn't want to go on the road, so we had to kind of rework the set in order to do the show without him. There was an added pressure there, but that was kind of the point where Jeffrey came in and sort of picked up the slack and helped us out.
The fact that Tom Johnson disappeared from the band meant that you really had to take a new direction, vocally and instrumentally, really, and you did that on taking it to the streets.
Yeah, when Tom stopped touring, we went ahead without him for a time, Jeff and I picking up the leads, and I ended up doing a lot of the vocals. Keith Knutson, who's another one of our drummers, also picked up some vocals and started doing things, but we were still, with Tom gone, we still felt a little bit of a void there, so Jeff says, I know a great piano player, if you'd like to. We had always talked about getting a keyboard player anyway. We used to tour with Bill Payne from Little Feat when he wasn't working with their band, and so we called Mike McDonald, who had been sort of a sideman for Steely Dan. He had done some background vocals in the studio and so on, but Steely Dan wasn't touring either, so we gave Michael a call, and he said, oh boy, I'd love to do it. So he came out and rehearsed for a few days and got it together, and that was, at that point, Michael was mainly a sideman for our band, but then probably about 3 or 4 months down the line, we realized we really had a talent that we were working with, and we asked him if he was writing any songs, and sure enough, he had some tunes, and he played them for us, and we were just blown out, so we asked him if he'd like to come into the studio and lay him down with us, and we'd be his backup band, and he could be our backup keyboard player, and we'd work together, and he sort of, at that point, became a member of the band.
Yeah. I think Mike's vocals worked very well on the Taking It to the Streets album, particularly the title track, I think.
Yeah, he's a great stylist, sort of in the Ray Charles tradition, I think, a little bit.
The changing sound of the Doobies, Pat, doesn't seem to have done you any harm in America at all, because your albums still sell supremely well over there. But do you think it's done you any harm in this country? Because there was definitely an identifiable sound with Tom Johnson, which people are probably missing a little bit.
Well, if anything, we're doing better here than we have in the past. We had never really sold any records, as far as I know, over here until Stampede. Stampede was really our first sort of major breakthrough in the British markets, and then Taking It to the Streets, I don't think was a giant record over here. But then with Livin' on the Fault Line, I feel like we've, again, made some inroads here. So what goes around comes around, I guess.
The new album, once again, it really extends your new direction, I think, a more jazzy feel to the music.
Yeah, to a certain extent, we've tried a few new things, what with synthesizers, and actually the most exciting thing on this album for me is being able to synthesize our guitars, which is something brand new we've never done before. We've always used gadgets and things, but we were able to actually feed the guitars through a synthesizer and produce a few new sounds and things. Got a little bit further out on some of the arrangements. We're able to extend things a little bit and give people a chance to do some good solos and things. Mm-hmm. There's also some real, probably more pop even than say Taking It to the Streets on this album. I think there's a little more pop sounding music on the other hand, so we sort of got the best of both worlds on this album, I feel.
Well, Pat, thank you very much for talking to us, and we'll play out with the new single, which is Little Darling.
Okie doke, thanks.
Bob Kilby talking to Pat Simmons of the Doobie Brothers, and that's their new single, Little Darling, I Need You. Well, the Doobies have been together now in one form or another for just about 7 years, which is about the half length of the time that the Stones have been around. We'll be